Hello and welcome to Byjus Exam Prep. Welcome to our weekly explain session. Under this series, every Friday at 8 p.m., we have been picking up a burning issue from current affairs of the last 1 week, and we discuss this topic in complete detail so that you can comprehensively cover these important topics for both your prelims and your mains. If you're benefiting from this initiative, do support us by pressing that like button, share your comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So let's start with this week's explained. And the topic for today's discussion is the MGNREGA scheme, or the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which has been making a lot of news over the last 1 week. So first, let's understand the context. Let's understand why this important topic is in news. In the recently presented union budget, the government has carried out a drastic reduction in the allocation for the important MGNREGA scheme. The statistics show that there has been a 33% budget cut compared to last fiscal's revised estimates. In the last fiscal year, according to the revised budget estimates, around 89,000 crore rupees were allocated to the MGNREGA scheme. So in this year's budget, the proposal is just for around 60,000 crore rupees for this important social security scheme. It amounts to a 33% reduction. So this has led activists and opposition parties to criticize the government, and they have said the government is trying to kill this important law and this important scheme, which has been a lifeline for the rural economy of India. These accusations, these allegations, they are not just based on this year's budget. If you look at the budgetary allocation in the previous budget as well, there was a 25% reduction. So in the last 2 years, in the last 2 budgets, there has been a considerable decline in the budgetary allocation for the MGNREGA scheme. So this has led activists and opposition parties to blame the government, and they have alleged that the government is trying to kill this scheme, mainly on political grounds. They have even alleged that the government is not interested in such pro-poor schemes, which helps the rural farmers, the rural communities. They have alleged that since the scheme was championed by the previous government, the current government is trying to kill this scheme on political grounds. These are the allegations and accusations. So let's fairly examine and carry out a balanced debate on this topic. Let's understand everything about MGNREGA. It's a very, very important topic for GS paper 1, GS paper 2, and as well as for your GS paper 3. Whatever we are going to discuss will help you in multiple subjects, including polity, economy, governance, social justice, and could also be very important for your prelims. So let's talk about the stand of the government as well, what the government has to say with regard to this budgetary cut, what's the rationale behind it. Let's evaluate whether these allegations are valid or not. But to carry out this important debate, first you should know what is the MGNREGA scheme. You should know the entire background. You should know the provisions of the scheme. What's the objective? What's the vision behind this important scheme? The MGNREGA scheme was previously just referred to as NREGA, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Later, it was named after the father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi. It's a flagship government scheme which is being implemented by the Ministry of Rural Development. So this scheme is based on a law which was enacted in the year 2005 by the Parliament of India. This law is considered as a vital piece of legislation with regard to rural development and socio-economic development, because this law guarantees the right to work. It provides a legal guarantee for ensuring a minimum of 100 days of work for rural households. Adults in rural areas who are willing to take up work, who are driven towards unemployment, mainly due to rural distress, agricultural distress, they are guaranteed 100 days of labor, paid labor, and hence it is seen as a very important employment guarantee scheme and as a social security scheme. This concept was brought out by the National Advisory Council, which was headed by opposition leader Sonia Gandhi back then when the Manmohan Singh government was in power. This law was brought out by the then UPA government in 2005. So the then Manmohan Singh government was being advised by this body called the National Advisory Council, headed by Sonia Gandhi. And this body included many eminent experts such as Harsh Mandar, Jean Rees, etc. These are top economists, social activists who have established credentials, and based on their concepts, based on their vision, this important framework was created. In fact, the National Advisory Council has been credited with many landmark legislations, including the right to information, the right to education, and as well as the National Food Security Act. National Advisory Council was equally controversial as well on political grounds because it's an unconstitutional body. It has no constitutional position, it has no legal mandate, and yet this body was advising the government of India. And the government was taking the recommendations and bringing out various laws. But one side of the argument is that this body did play an important role in bringing out key legislations and in ensuring important rights such as right to work, right to education, right to information, etc. See, providing for employment guarantee is nothing new. Even before this act, even before it was recommended by experts like Jean Rees and by bodies like National Advisory Council, even before that, we had few employment guarantee schemes. But the difference was they did not have a legal backing. Right to work was not recognized as a legal right. From 1960s itself, we have had quite a few schemes providing for employment in rural areas especially. In fact, even the P.V. Narasimha Rao government back in 1990s had recommended such a law. Had recommended a law where right to work could be recognized as a legal right. But this proposal did not gain much traction in the 1990s. Many of the previous schemes which were there, they never recognized right to work as a legal right. It didn't have any legal backing. And that is why this was seen as a landmark reform. It was seen as a landmark law which recognized right to work of rural households. And it was seen to be consistent with the principles of Article 41 of the Indian Constitution. As you know, Article 41 is part of Directive Principles of State Policy. This article directs the state to provide for right to work to all citizens and to provide public assistance to those who are unemployed. So the MGNREGA Act was seen to be consistent with the provisions of Article 41. This law was seen as a landmark reform, not just because it recognized right to work as a legal right, but it also had several landmark provisions. It had some key features which made this scheme a well-structured, well-conceptualized scheme. It has had a huge impact on the rural economy, and at the same time it has had few controversies and shortcomings as well. Later the scheme was renamed after Mahatma Gandhi and NREGA became MGNREGA. Now let me take you through the finer details of MGNREGA. Let's look at the overall structure of this program. What are the key provisions, the key features of the MGNREGA? See, this policy was designed to act as a social safety net for the rural households, for the rural poor, especially farmers, landless laborers, etc. And it guaranteed 100 days of employment in a year. This was provided as a legal right. So right to work became a legal right, at least for the rural households with the MGNREGA. It provided for a right-based framework. This was a standout feature of MGNREGA. The adults in rural households, if they are willing to work, if they are willing to take up government-assigned work, especially manual labor, they would be provided with the right to work and guaranteed 100 days of paid employment. So since it's a right-based framework, it helped in creating an alternate source of income for rural households. So adults in rural households could register for the scheme, get a job card, and when they demand work, it's a demand-based scheme. When they find themselves out of employment, when they are struggling without a reliable source of income, and if they approach the local administration demanding their right to work, this scheme would deliver this important livelihood opportunity and ensure that the rural community would get paid employment throughout the year. The best part about the act was that it provided for a time-bound guarantee. Now, if adults in a rural household, if they are interested to take up this work, they have to come out and register at the Gram Sabhas, the Gram Panchayats. Upon registration, they would be given a job card. They would be issued a job card. Their names would be entered on the rolls. And when they demand work, it is the job of the Panchayat, the local administration, to assign a manual labor, to assign some manual work and ensure that those who are looking for work are fulfilled their legal right. So it would not only solve the problem of unemployment, but would more importantly create an important source of reliable income for the rural households. And when they demand work based on their job card, within 15 days of the demand, they should be provided with employment. A time-bound guarantee was provided in the act. Within 15 days, roughly within 2 weeks, the state government, which is implementing the program at the state level, and the local administration, that is your Panchayati Raj institutions, particularly the Gram Sabhas, they would be bound to ensure that this rural adult would get paid employment within 15 days of demanding work. So up to 100 days in a financial year, rural employment was guaranteed under this act. And the best part about the scheme is that it promoted labor-intensive work. It would promote manual, unskilled labor to ensure that even farmers, peasants, landless laborers, etc., who don't have any special skills other than agriculture, farming, even they could carry out basic manual work which involves labor-intensive works, and they could get paid for it. So the scheme was designed in such a way that the fund allocation was in the ratio of 60:40 for wages and materials which are used to carry out the work. Since labor-intensive works were prioritized to ensure that the rural households get manual unskilled work, priority was given for labor-intensive work where wages was prioritized within the funding, within the structure of the scheme. Lesser amount should be spent on material, the material needed to carry out the work. The raw materials could be cement, stones, etc. So on the material, the spending has to be lower, around 40%. But 60% of the allocation should go towards wages, because the very purpose of MGNREGA is to guarantee payment, guarantee wages to the rural households. So that is why labor-intensive, manual, unskilled work was prioritized under the Act, with 60% priority being given to wages, whereas lesser priority being given to the materials which are being used. The law also mandates that no contractors or machinery will be used in carrying out the manual, unskilled work. Because if contractors are used, then what's the point? The contractors will bring in their own workers. It will not help the rural community. It will not help the target audience. And if machinery is used to carry out these basic tasks, then again, it will not be labor intensive. Instead of 50 people getting employment, just 5 to 10 people would be employed if machines are used, because machines tend to replace manual labor. So the law strictly prohibits the usage of contractors and machinery while executing these manual, unskilled tasks. This is a very, very important provision. This is non-negotiable under the law. The state government and the local administration, they have to ensure that contractors are not used, machinery is not used, and priority is given only for labor-intensive, manual, unskilled work. Because the whole idea here is to provide basic work opportunities to unskilled laborers, especially to farmers, peasants, landless laborers, etc., who cannot take up other tasks other than agriculture and farming. The other key feature of the law is that it provided for decentralized planning and decentralized implementation. It gave top priority to the Panchayati Raj institutions, to the PRIs, and especially the Gram Sabhas, which represent the grassroots institutions. They were empowered to recommend the works to be taken up depending on local needs. Because from district to district, village to village, the requirement with regard to local infrastructure, local facilities keeps changing. In some village, there might be a requirement for a better road. In another village, there might be requirement for a water conservation project. In another village, there might be requirement for a irrigation project. So to ensure that the local needs are accounted while these tasks are being carried out, while the manual labor work is being carried out, Gram Sabhas were empowered to recommend the work which will be taken up. Because Gram Sabhas will be better aware of the local needs, local issues. So they will identify the manual tasks which are to be carried out at the grassroots level, and at least 50% of the works have to be executed under the leadership of the Gram Panchayats. So it provided for true decentralization to fulfill the vision of the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act. So a principal role was given for Panchayati Raj institutions, not just in implementation, but also in planning the works and in monitoring the implementation of this important law. So decentralization was prioritized under MGNREGA, and this is another key feature of the law. Next, other than this, it provided for an inclusive approach. It focused on women workers as well to promote gender equality. It mandated that at least 1/3 of the beneficiaries of this act should be women. Because whenever there is rural distress, agricultural distress, the women in the rural households are under greater stress. They take a disproportionate impact of these adverse events. Now imagine there is a drought in rural areas and the crops will fail, right? It affects the whole rural economy. Rural households, farmers, laborers, etc. would be very hard hit, and especially the women in those households will take a bigger hit. So to provide for gender parity, 1/3 beneficiaries have to be women. And to ensure that these workers are protected and given basic facilities, because they are carrying out very hard labor. They will work out in the open, in the sun. They'll be working under hard conditions for a few hours a day. So to ensure that they are given basic facilities, the law mandated what kind of work site facilities have to be ensured by the Panchayat. Creche facilities have to be provided so that infants, young children can be taken care of by working women. Drinking water facilities, first aid, shade, everything has to be ensured while planning and executing these basic tasks at the grassroots. The law mandates this. It's mandatory for the state government and the Panchayat to ensure that these facilities are provided. Not only this, the scheme was very well conceptualized with regard to its implementation to ensure that there is no wastage of funds, no corruption, no diversion of funds. A lot of transparency and accountability provisions were also included. The law mandates proactive disclosure of the job cards, the details, the expenses on the works which are being carried out. So all the key metrics have to be proactively disclosed by the Gram Sabha and the Gram Panchayats. They have to publicly display the information so that everybody is aware as to how the money is being spent, how the tasks are being executed. Along with that, the government also mandated social audits. Non-government entities would be roped in to conduct a social audit to check whether this scheme was having a social impact, whether the desired social outcomes were being achieved, whether we were achieving optimal social and economic development through this scheme. A grievance redressal mechanism was also made mandatory to listen to the complaints and grievances of the targeted beneficiaries. Advanced monitoring tools were also introduced under the scheme, such as MIS tools, Management Information Systems. Advanced management tools, which are usually used in government secretariats, in the corporate sector. Such advanced management and operational techniques and tools were brought in to ensure that there is accountability in the scheme and the progress is effectively tracked. To keep track of key metrics, key result areas, key performance indicators, management information system was brought in and all the data would be placed online. All the data would be placed on online portals so that the information is freely available to the public to minimize any chances of diversion and corruption. So transparency accountability provisions were integral to this law. And with regard to implementation as well, several guidelines have been laid out under the law itself to ensure that the targeted beneficiaries get the maximum output from this. With regard to funding, the central government, which was driving this flagship program, took up a greater responsibility for paying the wages, especially to the intended beneficiaries, the farmers, landless laborers, etc., who would be taking up unskilled manual work. 100% of their wages would be paid by the central government. 75% of the material cost would be borne by the center, including the cost paid for few skilled, semi-skilled workers who may have to be hired to carry out some basic tasks. Because let's say while repairing a road or while constructing a basic project, you can't just rely on unskilled labor. You may have to bring in few skilled laborers as well, just a few of them. So for that, central government would provide only a part of the payment. Rest would come from the state government because state would play a pivotal role in implementing the scheme. A provision of incentives and disincentives was created to ensure that the states will abide by the whole concept of this scheme, to ensure that states will not use excessive material, to ensure they will not hire unnecessary skilled and semi-skilled laborers. The states were also mandated to pitch in with 25% of the funding for material and skilled labor. So since the states have to pay for this, there is a natural hesitance. There is a natural disincentive created for the states to stay away from using expensive material and from employing skilled labor where it is not necessary. Another disincentive was created for the state governments. The states have to bear the 100% cost of unemployment allowance, which has to be paid if they don't provide work within 15 days of the work being demanded by the beneficiary. I told you earlier, there is a time-bound guarantee. If an adult from a rural household has demanded work and within 15 days the work has not been assigned, then the state government is penalized for this. This is like a penalty. The state government is mandated to pay an unemployment allowance, and the 100% cost of this is to be borne by the state government. So this is again a disincentive, which is pushing the states to ensure that within the mandated time period, work is assigned and allocated to the intended beneficiary. So from a theoretical point of view, from a conceptual point of view, this was a very well designed program, a very well conceptualized Social Security Act. Now, if you look at the kind of works which were taken up under MGNREGA, just to give you an idea what kind of works were being executed, a variety of tasks at the grassroots were the focus, where manual labor is needed. Manual unskilled labor is needed to create basic assets which will help in rural development. This included water conservation programs. It's a priority for rural areas. For example, removing silt from the lake and ponds, creating contour bunding or digging irrigation canals, channels, preventing drought by mitigation measures, preventing soil erosion by creating structural barriers. So such physical work at the ground level was prioritized, where the local adults can be brought in by the Gram Sabha. The Gram Sabha would identify what kind of work has to be prioritized, and the community would get involved to execute these local tasks together. Only if necessary, some skilled or semi-skilled laborers would be brought in, but no contractors can be used and no machinery can be used. So like this, many other tasks were taken up. For example, sanitation related work, building toilets in schools, building public toilets, providing drinking water facilities, repairing roads for connectivity, repairing roads and bridges, carrying out basic construction work, ensuring land development to protect soil fertility. All of this requires physical manual work, it's labor intensive, and the farmers and laborers will be equipped enough to handle these kind of tasks. So Gram Sabha would identify these tasks depending on the local requirements, and the people would execute them so that they could get paid under this ambitious program. Is that clear? These are the variety of works which are being taken up. Irrigation related, land related, sanitation related schemes, improving local infrastructure, local connectivity. So all such works have been taken up under MGNREGA all across the country. The other important features of MGNREGA is that the wages which has to be paid, it has to be in line with the provisions of the Minimum Wages Act. The wages which is paid cannot be lower than the minimum standard which has been set through this law. States have to ensure that this is the minimum wage they will pay, but they will have the flexibility to pay more as well if they want. Is that clear? The minimum wage given to agricultural laborers under this law is the standard, it's the threshold which was mandated by the Act. The other key feature of the law is that it was providing for a demand-driven scheme. The beauty of a demand-driven employment guarantee scheme is that it will account for any adverse developments which might happen. Let's say all of a sudden there is a crisis in a rural area. Let's say the economy has crashed in the rural area or crops have failed. There is a drought, there is a disaster. So immediately there will be a sudden jump in the requirement for jobs because more farmers, laborers would be driven out of employment. They would be deprived of their basic income. So to account for this, it has provided for a demand-driven approach. As and when demand increases for work, the law ensures that all those who are demanding work will be provided, guaranteed the right to work. This scheme over the years, over the last 18 odd years, has functioned phenomenally well overall. If you look at the broad performance of the scheme, it has had a huge impact on the rural economy, and as of this year, around 15.4 active workers have been registered under MGNREGA. These many job cards have been issued to rural adults, and it clearly shows the demand that exists in rural areas for employment guarantee. It shows the vulnerability they face as well. As you know, India's agriculture, India's rural areas are highly vulnerable. We are still a subsistence farming economy. Majority of our population, at least 60%, are still employed in rural areas, especially in agriculture, right? So this makes them all the more vulnerable because farming in India is still largely monsoon dependent, rain dependent, and it's dependent on various other factors, and in any adverse condition, agriculture takes a very big hit. Farmers are pushed to borrow loans. Even other alternate sources like animal husbandry suffers during drought conditions, during disasters, etc. And hence, such a scheme is very, very important and vital to protect the rural population. It's like a safety net for them, a guaranteed income of 100 days so that they can sustain their livelihood and in return contribute to the economy. Along with creating a safety net for the rural population, the scheme is also creating assets in rural areas. Don't forget that. You cannot forget that through these manual tasks, long-lasting assets are being created in rural areas by improving connectivity, by improving irrigation, water conservation, by providing for toilets, drinking water. Long-term assets are being created which provides for broader socio-economic development in the rural areas. So this scheme has definitely had a very big impact on India's rural economy. Many experts have pointed out, even international institutions have pointed out, that MGNREGA helps fulfilling several goals under Sustainable Development Goals. Several targets that have been listed under SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, get fulfilled through the MGNREGA scheme. For example, tackling poverty, tackling hunger, because if people have enough money, enough income, their nutritional needs will be met. Rural population could be lifted out of poverty, especially during adverse circumstances. Inequalities can be reduced. Gender inequality, for example, because the law mandates that 1/3 of the beneficiaries have to be women, right? Social inequalities can be brought down. It provides for better infrastructure, innovation, ensures the health of the rural population as well. As long as people have enough income with them, even their health standards will improve. It will improve education standards, provides for decent work and economic growth, and guarantees gender equality. So all these targets of Sustainable Development Goals are also being met through MGNREGA. So over the last 18 years of its implementation, it has had a huge noticeable impact. It has definitely created a reliable alternate source of income for rural households. There is no denying this fact. It has boosted rural demand and improved purchasing power, thus contributing to the growth of the Indian economy as well. Because please understand, the money which is being placed in the hands of the rural households, it's not going waste. It creates a cyclical benefit. If you're increasing the income of rural households by providing them 100 days of paid labor, the rural households are going to spend that money back because their purchasing power has increased. They will use this money to purchase essential items like food grains. They'll use it for essential services like education, healthcare. So all this money comes back into the system and boosts rural demand, which is vital for the Indian economy. And more importantly, as a social security scheme, it acts as a shield against any form of rural agrarian distress. If rural economy is under distress, if agriculture has taken a hit, if farmers are being pushed to borrow loans and if they are being subjected to the exploitation of money lenders, if droughts and natural conditions have destroyed crops and farming, in any such distress situation, rural households have a safety net. It's like an umbrella protecting them, and thus it reduces distress migration from rural to urban areas as well. This is the wide-ranging impact of MGNREGA. To justify this argument, just to let you know that I'm not making blanket statements here, let me give you a real example. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020 and when the country went into a lockdown, the most hit, the hardest hit were migrant workers, farmers and the landless. Many migrant workers from urban areas, they rushed back to rural areas. They went back. We witnessed a reverse migration taking place. Crores of people in the country, millions of them, were without employment, without adequate income for months together. At the right time, the Modi government, which realized the gravity of the situation, used the flexibility of the MGNREGA Act, increased the budgetary allocation for MGNREGA by a very significant number, and provided for employment for many rural households, which helped in sustaining rural demand by improving their purchasing power. This is a well-established fact. I'll show you a graph as well later to show how government spending on the scheme went up all of a sudden in 2020. This was a direct result of the pandemic. The pandemic created a lot of rural distress. It was hurting the weaker sections of the society. And through MGNREGA, the government was able to protect the rural households. Despite this impact and significance of MGNREGA, there have been a lot of shortcomings in the implementation. There have been many critics of MGNREGA who say that this is wasteful expenditure. It is like a free subsidy the government is doling out, which is burdening the Indian economy and the Indian budget. Many have argued this scheme is not useful in protecting the farmers in rural areas, and it is neither useful in creating long-term assets. And this criticism has some validity. There is justification for criticism against MGNREGA as well. Let me point out the shortcomings in its implementation. One of the biggest shortcomings is that there have been delays in disposing or in dispersing the funds on time. In many cases, work has been assigned to the manual laborers, those who are seeking work. They have executed the task as well, but the payments have been delayed. This is due to inefficiency in our governance, in our administration. See, under MGNREGA, to provide for better transparency and accountability and to ensure quick payments, on-time payments, the Act mandated that the payments will be provided directly into bank accounts and post office accounts. It provided for bank transfers. Later, when DBT was introduced, direct benefit transfer was introduced, digital transactions were carried out, online transactions would take place to ensure that timely payment and effective payment happens without any provision for leakages. Despite this provision, on the ground, there has been shortcomings in its implementation. States have delayed the dispersal of funds. The Gram Panchayats have messed up the dispersal of funds. There have been inordinate delays, which has hampered the very effectiveness of the scheme. So if the rural households don't get payment on time, even after carrying out the manual labor, next time they'll not be interested to come and ask for work. Please remember, it's a demand-driven scheme. If they don't get payment, they'll have no motivation to go back to work and ask work under MGNREGA, and as a result, the scheme itself will collapse. This has been a very big problem across multiple states. This is due to inefficiency of the state governments, the Gram Panchayats, the Panchayati Raj institutions, and the overall weakness in Indian administration. There have been many cases where payments have been delayed or even jobs have not been created on time. The 15-day deadline has been missed. And even after missing the deadline, unemployment allowance has not been paid. I told you that it's mandatory to pay unemployment allowance if job is not given within 15 days. Despite the legal mandate, states have not paid the unemployment allowance. Or there have been inordinate delays for weeks, for several months. So this has been a very big shortcoming in the implementation of the scheme. The other big challenge is that even this scheme has been hit by corruption and poor governance. It's pure bad governance on the part of government institutions, and corruption has hit MGNREGA as well. Many instances came out, especially during social audits, where fake job cards had been created. The person wouldn't even exist, or the person wouldn't have even registered under MGNREGA, and they wouldn't have asked for work. But local officials, in collusion with local politicians, would create fake job cards. Without even carrying out the tasks, they would show on paper that these tasks were carried out, that these manual labor was executed, and the funds would be diverted. There was leakage in MGNREGA as well, which was a direct result of corruption which has become ingrained in Indian administration. So this was a critical flaw. You can't afford fabrication of job cards, fake entries, and eventual diversion of funds happening in such a critical scheme. The other issue is that in many states, caste-based divide was being noticed. While registering the rural households for job, while assigning them tasks, while paying them, caste-based segregation and caste-based divide was noticed, especially in tribal pockets of India, like Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha. There has been a bias against scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and also against other backward classes. With regard to providing job and making the payments on time, there has been a negative bias against the lower sections, the lower castes. This is a very serious concern which highlights the social divide in our country, and it was affecting the implementation of the scheme. The other problem was the Panchayati Raj institutions were unable to cope with the task which was assigned to them. They would plan the work, assign the task, but they wouldn't monitor the task effectively. They wouldn't pick the right kind of jobs. So as a result, long-term assets were not created. Several wasteful projects were taken up, redundant works were executed, which wouldn't contribute in any way to the rural economy and to the socio-economic development of the region. Many tasks were left incomplete. The Gram Panchayats and the three-tiered Panchayati Raj institutions, starting right from the district level, Zilla Panchayat, due to inefficiencies in our Panchayati Raj system, they would take up wasteful tasks which would serve no purpose to the society, which wouldn't help the rural areas in any way. Many tasks were left midway, they wouldn't be completed. And even if completed, they would be wasteful tasks. Within few months, those projects would fall apart. Let's say they have created a small pond to store water for irrigation needs and drinking water needs. In one rainy season, the pond would get destroyed. Let's say they have taken on some irrigation work or they have built a toilet. The toilet would become non-functional. It wouldn't have enough water supply. So many such redundancies were noticed, and hence experts have argued that this is a wasteful scheme. It has not contributed to any form of social security, and they have argued that it hasn't created any long-term assets. So the critics' argument is that this scheme has just become a burden on the government. It is not helping in rural development in any way, not acting as a social safety net for the rural areas, and at the same time, it is resulting in wasteful government expenditure, which is leading to more deficit, fiscal deficit for the government. So this is the other side of the argument. Now, since the scheme was championed by the then UPA government headed by former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, the scheme received very high priority from 2005 to 2014. Now this was natural, it was expected, because politically it was important for the then government, the then ruling party, to ensure the implementation of the scheme and its success. So for almost 9 years, since 2006 to 2014, till the Manmohan Singh government was in power, the scheme was a flagship scheme. It was championed by the government with high budgetary allocation, and despite the shortcomings and its failures, the government kept backing the MGNREGA scheme. Despite all the criticism and the shortcomings, the government would continue providing higher allocation. The argument of the then Manmohan Singh government was this scheme was having a very noticeable impact. For example, during the 2008-2009 recession, the global recession, Indian economy took a massive hit. When the Indian economy was suffering, the impact was felt in rural areas as well, and the government argued that MGNREGA played a very big role in reviving rural demand. The Manmohan Singh government argued that this high budgetary allocation was justified. Promoting this scheme as a flagship scheme was justified because it was putting money in the hands of the rural people during times of economic distress. It was increasing purchasing power in rural areas, thereby driving rural demand, and thus contributing to the recovery of the Indian economy following the global recession. This was the political justification of the then government. There is valid data to show that indeed rural demand increased because of MGNREGA during this crisis period. But however, one cannot ignore the fact that there was a lot of wasteful expenditure. Long-term assets weren't really created. There was a lot of diversion of funds, delays in payments. These shortcomings were always there. But however, it was a political priority for the then government to back the scheme and give it higher budgetary allocation. But after the government changed in 2014, after the Modi government came to power, critics are pointing out that there is a deliberate targeting of this scheme. They provide data to show that there has been a considerable decrease in the allocation of budget support for this important program. Compared to the previous allocation under the former government, there has been a stagnation for few years. Compared to the total expenditure of the government, hardly around 2.4 to 2.7% on rural development spend was being allocated for MGNREGA. You will see a significant jump in 2020, as I pointed out. This was a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Modi government did significantly increase the expenditure on MGNREGA to provide for a rural safety net, to address the problems created by the pandemic, and you do see a jump in 2020. But from here onwards, in the last two budgets, in the last 2-3 years, you see a considerable drastic decline in budgetary allocation. This is what leads to concerns amongst activists and the opposition parties. This is what leads them to say that the government is trying to kill the law and kill this important scheme on political grounds. Because this was a scheme which was championed by the former government, which was ruled by the Congress, right? So there could be political agenda to drive down the budgetary allocation for the scheme according to the activists and the critics. Now let me present the other side of the story, or the other side of the argument. Let's see what activists are calling for, what are they demanding, and let's look at the other side of the argument, that is the government's justification, what the Modi government is saying. According to social activists and few economic experts, 60,000 crore rupees which has been allocated in this budget is nowhere sufficient for MGNREGA. They've carried out few studies recently and they've said, if you have to fulfill the legal guarantee of 100 days of work in this year, and if you take into account 15 crore registered job seekers, the government should have allocated 2.72 lakh crore rupees, which is more than 4-5 times what the government has actually allocated. They have said, at least to provide 40 days of work, if not 100, the government should have allocated 1.24 lakh crore rupees, which is more than double the current allocation. So they're using these statistics and this data to say that the government allocation currently is simply not sufficient. 60,000 crores is not enough. And it's clear that the government is trying to kill the scheme according to the social activists. But the government has said there is a logic, there is a rationale behind reducing the allocation. The government has said this is a demand-driven scheme. Based on demand, the scheme will be expanded or contracted. The government says the demand has reduced in the last few years for rural employment. I'll explain why. The economic survey which was recently presented on the 31st of January before the budget provides the rationale, it provides the reason why demand for work under MGNREGA has gone down in rural areas. Based on this valid argument, the government has said MGNREGA is a flexible scheme, it's a demand-driven scheme. Currently, there is no high demand for work in rural areas because our economy has improved and hence the current budget allocation is sufficient for this year. But if some adverse development were to come up, like the pandemic which happened in 2020, or the recession which happened in 2008, 2009, if some kind of economic crisis were to happen, let's say agriculture was to fail, production goes down, or drought conditions are witnessed, then the government will show the flexibility and it will boost employment creation under MGNREGA with higher budgetary allocation. Because government will always have that flexibility. The government has said budgetary allocation, which has been kept at 60,000 crore, is sufficient to meet the current demand. But if demand were to go up, the flexibility will always be there under the scheme to increase funding and ensure that those who are seeking jobs will get the job on time. This is again a valid argument of the government based on established statistics and data. This is where I would like to show you what the economic survey is saying about MGNREGA and the current status of job seekers under the scheme. This would be my last argument before we close the discussion. The economic survey that was presented last week has clearly pointed out that on a year-to-year basis, there has been a clear noticeable decline in the monthly demand for manual work in the rural economy. With data, economic survey is pointing out that the demand for work has reduced, and the reason is the economy is bouncing back from the impact of the pandemic. Agricultural productivity has improved. We have registered a very strong agricultural growth in the last 2 years, which means farmers, then laborers in rural areas, they have enough work, they have enough income. So they are not seeking out work under MGNREGA, even though they might be registered under the MGNREGA scheme. You might have 15.4 crore beneficiaries registered, but not all of them are asking for work. This is what the government is saying. In the last 1 year alone, in this fiscal from 2022 to 2023, the government has said, the economic survey has brought out this data, that out of 15.4 crore people who have registered under MGNREGA, who have job cards, just half of them, 6.49 crore adults, have sought employment under MGNREGA. Out of them, 6.48 crore households were offered manual work through the government, but only 5.7 crore adults took up the employment. So this clearly shows that the demand for work under MGNREGA has reduced, which is a sign of ongoing economic recovery. The demand for MGNREGA work has come back to pre-pandemic levels because agricultural productivity has improved, the rural economy has stabilized, and growth in rural areas is coming back to pre-pandemic days. So the economic survey is offering this justification based on which the government has made the budgetary allocation. So this is the other side of the argument. Now, we are not here to take sides. We are here to discuss such controversial issues and look at the debate from both sides of the argument and develop a critical analysis. So now that we have seen both sides of the argument, let's conclude this discussion by discussing the way forward. What can be done going ahead? See, the significance of the MGNREGA scheme is undisputed. Like I said, there is enough data to show the scheme is very, very helpful in supporting the rural economy, in creating a safety net for farmers and the rural workers. This is an undisputed fact. It is helping us achieve the goals of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It is helping us tackle several socio-economic challenges in rural areas, and it is providing for rural development. So there is no question of scrapping such an important scheme. But however, the government should definitely show flexibility to accommodate for the rise in demand for jobs if it were to occur. Let's say some distress comes up this year or next year. Suddenly there is an increase in the number of people seeking jobs under MGNREGA. Then government should show the flexibility to fulfill the demand and ensure right to work is fulfilled, which is a legal right, and this requires budgetary flexibility as well. Maybe for the time being, the government is right, 60,000 crores might be enough for this fiscal. If something adverse were to happen, if the demand for jobs were to increase, the government has a responsibility to ensure that the legal right to work is fulfilled by increasing the budgetary allocation. The government did this during the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll need a similar response from the government in the future as well. At the same time, the state governments and the Panchayati Raj institutions have a bigger responsibility to plug the gaps in its implementation. All the shortcomings we discussed, the fake job cards, the diversion of funds, the delays in payment, the lack of asset creation, the caste-based divide. All these shortcomings have to be addressed in implementation, and this is the job of the state government and the PRIs. So this has to be the conclusion and the way forward for you if there is a, let's say, a essay topic or a mains question based on MGNREGA. So now I can convincingly say that we have covered all the aspects of this important scheme. We have discussed the pros and cons, the impact, the shortcomings, why the budget has been cut, why the activists are criticizing, why they have concerns, and what the government is saying. This discussion is more than enough to address this important topic, and on this note, I would like to bring my discussion to an end. I really hope it was a fruitful discussion. Do let me know how it went by pressing the like button, by sharing your comments, and do subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.